Now we're on Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, and the Gemara thinks that maybe because the discussion between Reb Shimon Shizuri and Rabbi Tarfon took place and was recorded only in a brisa, not in a mishnah, maybe I need to know that even in a brisa, we still pass like Reb Shimon Shizuri. Mika Omer Mishnah Seinu. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. Reb Chanina never made a statement that we always paskin like Reb Shimon Shizuri in a mishnah, as if to imply that if it's not in the Mishnah, it was left out of the Mishnah instead of Raisa, we don't necessarily accept Rav Shimon Shizuri. He never made that statement. What did he say? He said, Kol makom sheshana kama. Wherever you see that Rav Shimon Shizuri expressed his halachic thinking, his halachic opinion, we paskin like him. So there's no difference in a Mishnah and a Brisa. The Gemara ends up without an answer to this question, why he had to go ahead and tell him that we accept Rav Shimon Shazuri even in the case of Tarovis, of Chulin and Mas. Now we go back to the sugya of Sefer Torah. And again, we're addressing the Sofrim and how to prepare a kosher Sefer Torah. Kera haba b'shnei shitim. The parchment on which the Sefer Torah was written had a cut in it. Now, do we have to throw out that whole urea, that whole column, and start from scratch? Or can we sew up the kera, the place where it was cut? It's kind of like, not that I'm equating it, but, sometimes, you or one of your kids or gets a cut, and you go to the physician. The question is whether he needs surgery. Whether he needs stitching or not stitching, or maybe they could just put glue in. And so it all depends on how how severe the cut is. So the question is, can we stitch up the cut and be machshir the Sefer Torah? So it depends. If it's ba b'shnei shitim, let's say, for example, the cut came from on top or from on bottom. Like imagine somebody took a scissors and cut it. How far up or how far down did that cut go? If it went for two lines, then you can still stitch it up. As we'd say in Yiddish, nishkefel, it's not so terrible. But b'shalosh, if it went through three lines, then no way, no how. That's already a ripped column of a Sefer Torah, and it has to be al yitfar. It has to be replaced. There's no option of sewing it up, because after you sew it up, it's going to look really, really strange. You have a parchment that's, but if it's a small cut, it only covers two lines, then you could sew it up. Now, the Rishonim point out over here, I just have to say this as we go on, that we are only measuring the size of the cut, but no letters were cut. So you follow? Like, let's say, for example, there are spaces above the letters, below the letters, the margins, there are spaces between each line. That's where the cut took place. But if the cut was on the letters themselves, then no matter what, you have to replace that column. No room for sewing it up. Amalei Rabba Zutra Le Rav Ashi Hachi Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah B'Difti Shendrom Hadi Amrin B'Shalosh Al Yitfar. This ruling that if the cut reached three lines, then you have to throw it out, should be limited. It does not always absolutely apply. Lo Amaran Ella Ba'atika. There are two types of parchments. There's old parchment, and then there's relatively new parchment. The new parchment, for example, is very light in color. It's like almost light beige, if you will, or white. And therefore, the cut doesn't really show that badly. So even if the cut was three lines deep or three lines long, if you want to say, it's not going to be a problem. And you could be machshir the Sefer Torah by sewing it up. But if it's an atike, and you see a Sefer Torah that's brown, it looks old. Like right now, I have a Sefer Torah that's being fixed. It's probably 150 years old, needs serious fixing, and the parchment is already browned. But says Rava, if it's chadita and if it's still fresh and white, then you know what? Even if it was cut more than 3 lines, then you could still be machshir it and sew it up. I don't know how many lines he would allow. I don't think he would allow you to, to okay a cut that went through, the whole Uriah is hanging by the top. But now the Gemara goes a step further here in the name of Yomi Difti to limit this discussion and put it into perspective. Because you might ask me how old is old and how new is new. But the Gemara says that lo atikta mamish. When we talk about, in inverted commas, you talk about a parchment. We don't an old parchment. We don't mean old, like it's not an antique from 150 years ago. And lo chadata mamish. And we say if it's a relatively new parchment, we were more makil. That doesn't mean new that it was literally, a day old or a month old. Ella, it all depends on how the parchment was prepared. And there's something called afitzon. In the translation here, he translates afitzon as golnut juice, okay? And elaha de lo afitzon v'had afitzon. So we'll interpret this Gemara now according to Rashi, namely that if the parchment was treated with this gallnut solution, its juice, then even if it's a brand new Sefer Torah, it gets brown. And therefore the law of chadati, that you can have an extended cut and then fix it up, that doesn't apply. If, on the other hand, lo afitzon, there was no application of this gallnut juice to the parchment, then even if it's an old Sefer Torah, it still retains enough of its luster, of its youth, of its white color, so that we can be machshir even after it got sliced. V'hani mili, now we talk about how to sew it up. Now we have something called grudin, and we have something called gidin. The gidin are sinews that are taken from a kosher animal. And we have halach l'Moshe Sinai that sewing the columns of a Sefer Torah together requires that we use a material which is called gidin, meaning sinews that are taken from a kosher animal. But grudin, which just to take threads and start sewing up the parchment, that we can't allow. So again, the sewing, in a case that you have to sew up a kera, a cut, has to be done with gidin. By Rabbi Yehuda bar Abba, bein daf ledaf, bein shita l'shita mai. Rabbi Yehuda raises 2 questions. His first question is, what happens if the cut took place not in the written part of the column, but rather in the space between one column and the next? Therefore, we might say that even if the rip was very long, and then you sew it up, it doesn't really damage the aesthetic look of the Sefer Torah, because it's not on the same section of the column that you read with the osios of the letters, but rather it's on the side. It's bein daf l'daf. Then we have bein shita l'shita. What happens if there was a cut between one line and the other? And here also, when you sew it up, if you do a good job sewing it, it's not so apparent. It doesn't really ruin the aesthetic beauty of the Sefer Torah. Take who the Gemara says we don't know. And it's really fascinating here that the Rambam in Hilchas Sefer Torah paskins that in such cases the Sefer Torah is considered kosher. Now we have a rule called Safek Doraisa L'Chumra. And in this case, we don't know exactly what the final outcome is and what the law is with regard to these cases of Bein Daf L'Daf, Bein Shita L'Shita. And yet the Rambam is willing to be Mekil and accept this Sefer Torah by just simply sewing it up, even though the Gemara ends up with a teiku, it should be Safek Doraisa L'Chumra. But apparently the Rambam held that even this idea that you can't sew it up when there's a very serious tear, that's only D'Rabbanan. On a D'Oraisa level, the Sefer Torah is still kosher. In any event, Omar Rav Zeiri, Omar Rav Chanan Omar Rav, Mezuzah sheksova shtayim shtayim ksherim. Interesting. You know, when you think of a line in Stam, it would probably be a full line of, 10 words, like we spoke about Mishpach Hoseim yesterday. And yet, according to what the Gemara is claiming in the name of Rav, all you need is 2 words on a line. But, there's always a but. What does he mean 2 words on a line? Shtayim v'sholosh v'yachas. What he really meant to say was that it looks like a poem, and you've got 2 words, 3 words, and then 1 word. It forms some sort of a pattern, a beautiful pattern. Rav Nachman, kol shkein shasok sheira. Not only would I tell you that this mezuzah is valid, I would tell you that it's even better than valid. Making it look like a poem enhances the beauty of the mezuzah. I never saw a mezuzah that looked like a poem. Did you? You did? No. Meisvei. The Gemara is not happy with this statement of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. We have a brisa that says Asok Shera, O Shira Kamosa, Psula. Shira means a poem. And if he made it like a poem, and we assume that this is, referring to 2 words and then 3 words and then 1 word, Kshera. Oshira Kamosa. Now Kamosa means like Oz Yashir. So if you take a look at a Sefer Torah for the reading of Oz Yashir, Parshas B'Shalach, you'll see that there are spaces, blank spaces here and there and there and there. It looks like a shira, like a poem, because that's what it is. It's shira sayam. And yet, the Brisa rules psula, that if you make it look like a poem, it's possible. We just finished saying that according to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, it's laudatory. It's even lechatchila. It's even enhances the sefer. Morantz's Kitanya. When Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak spoke, he spoke about a mezuzah, but this brisa that you're quoting now is Ahibah Sefer Torah. In a Sefer Torah, where there's a loch of shira with regard to that parsha called Shira Sayam, and maybe Oz Yashir, and maybe Hazinu at the end. So if you take another parchment and you make it into a poem, that's not acceptable. That invalidates the Sefer Torah. Because we always have to distinguish between regular writing and a poem. But where did Rav make this statement? Rav Nachman make this statement that Asa, if he made it as a shira, it's laudatory. That's with regard to a mezuzah. Itmarnami Omer Rabbi Yochanan. The Amri Leo, the say was Omer of Acha Bar Bachana Omer of Yochanan. Mezuzah shasa shtayim v'sholosh v'yachas kshera. Right, so we have a statement here to the effect that if you make the mezuzah look like a poem, it's valid. Uvad shelo yasenu kekuba, uvad shelo yasenu kezana. Kuba is a tent, and zanav is a tail. So what does this mean? If it's wide at the bottom and narrow on top, like for example, let's say he wrote 3 words on the bottom, 2 on the middle, and then 1 on the top. So it's wide at the bottom and it's narrow at the top. And that's called a kuba, like a tent, like a little teepee. You remember the teepees that the Indians, it's like a inverted cone kind of thing. So that's not acceptable in a Sefer Torah. I'm sorry, that's not acceptable even in a mezuzah. And kizanav is just the opposite. It, instead of getting narrower as you go towards the top, it's wide on the top and then it gets narrow towards the bottom. Rav Chizda, another halacha regarding a mezuzah, al ha'aretz. These are the last 2 words in the mezuzah. B'shita achrona, they should be on the last line. What does it mean they should be on the last line? Don't write the whole pasuk, just write the 2 words al ha'aretz at the conclusion of the mezuzah. And now we have a machlokes. How exactly do you pull this off? The 2 words ala aretz on the last line of the mezuzah. Ika the Amir, according to one opinion, bisof shita. He should make a space, a blank space on the bottom line, and when he gets to the end of that line, he writes the 2 words ala aretz. And we'll see how he derives this from a pasuk. But Ika the Amir, according to a variant opinion, bitchilas shita. He should write ala aretz at the beginning of the line and leave the remainder of the line blank. So again, according to the first Lishna, what we're saying is that the entire last line is blank except for the last 2 words ala aretz. According to the second Lishna, you start with ala aretz at the beginning of the line, and the rest of the line, the remainder, is blank. And the Gemara explains. Mandi Omer b'sof shita. According to the first Mandi Omer, says that you should leave the entire line, ending line, bottom line, blank until you get to ala aretz at the end. That's based on a pasuk in Tehillim. And what does David HaMelech say in Tehillim? He says, Ki gov hashamayim al haaretz, which literally means that the length and the space is as great as the distance between heavens and earth. But we're going to derive from this pasuk, Kegova shamayim ala aretz. Oh, I forgot to tell you that the literal translation of this pasuk is referring to how long we'll live, the tzaddikim will live in the future at the end of days, and it will be Kegova shamayim ala aretz. In other words, your days will be very long. So what happens is, if you write the 2 words al haaretz at the end of the line, then right above it, it'll say Kigova Shamayim. Right? Right? What's the whole pasuk? I'm sorry, I don't have it. Oh yeah, here it is. Right, that's the last pasuk in the mezuzah. So there's Kimei Shamayim and Ala Aretz. So Kimei Shamayim is at the end of the line, and now, according to this Lishna, we want to put Al Haaretz, the last two words in the mezuzah also at the end of the line. So then you see ala oretz here, and above it you have the heavens, if you follow it. Ala shamayim. So that's called kigova shamayim. Uman diyom etchila shita, but according to Mandiyom, it says you start ala oretz at the beginning of the line. Ki echi d'merachka shamayim me'oretz. There's a different message that we're trying to convey here, and that is that the shamayim is here and the oretz is here, and that that conveys the message that the shamayim is that much further away from the oretz. Rabbi Chelbo, Chazina leila Rav Huna, I saw Rav Huna, dekarich la me'echad klap ishma. Now, after you write the klaf, you have to wind it up, roll it up, and put it into the bias, what's called the bias. And I saw Rav Huna, he would roll it from left to right, meaning from the last word in the line, which is echad, to the first word in the line, which is shma. Correct. But now he testifies that he saw another thing about Rav Huna, and that is ose parshioseha stumos. Now we have parshios in the Torah, and we have a Mesores regarding a Sefer Torah, which parsha is stuma and which is psucha. In a psucha, you'll end, one parsha with wherever it is on that line, and then you'll start another line. That's called psucha. But in stuma, you just continue writing from one parsha to the next. Now, with regard to mezuzah, what's the deal? And that's what Rabbi Chelbo is testifying about Rav Huna, that he would decide, he made a decision that the parshios of the mezuzah should be stumos. Meisvei, the Gemara says, I don't get it. We have a brisa that says, Amr of Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbi Meir hayakosva al duchs tetumus kimin daf. Right? He used to write a mezuzah on a certain type of parchment, which is called peeled hide. Because a hide is split into two layers. The outer layer is called the klaf, and it's thinner than the klipa, the peel. And the word duchsitus is a composite, a hybrid of two words, duch, which is place, and sustus, which is flesh. So it's called because it's the layer of the hide that's closest to the flesh. And then we'll just take a look here for a second on the next Amud, Lamed Beis. We osa revach milamala v'revach milamata. Right? He should leave a space. We spoke about this on the margin on the top, a margin on the bottom. Should be even more of a margin on the bottom, as we discussed. The osa parshiosa psuchos. Just the opposite. They should be psuchos. Amarti lo, I asked him, Rebbe, my tam, why does it have to be psuchos? Now, the underlying premise of this kasha of my taima, why does it have to be psuchos, is that if you look at the Sefer Torah itself, these parshios that are included, Vayim Shemoah, in the mezuzah are actually stumos. They're not psuchos. Amali hoil v'ein smuchos min Torah. And we have to figure out what this means, but that will Belina pick up tomorrow. Okay, then? So tomorrow is Thursday. I have a little bit of a conflict tomorrow.